All right. Only 23 minutes late. We're going to get started now. So, those who don't know me, my name's Aidan. I'm one of the organizers here at the Popular University for Palestine. I am not much of a lecturer, and I have the handwriting of a serial killer. So Andy here is going to be writing on the board for me. The question that we're going to be talking about today, essentially, is reform or revolution. It's the title of one of the texts, but I think it's also the main thing we're going to talk about today. The thing that what are we talking about reforming or revolting against? And that is going to be the state. Which is why the first text that we read this week was the first chapter of State and Revolution by Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or better known as Lenin. I'm assuming everyone here who knows who Lenin is? Cool. Skip the brief bio part. The historical context of this text, though, is essentially he wrote it in between the two revolutions of 1917. Once he had returned to Russia from exile, the Tsar had been overthrown by the provisional government, and at this point, all of the socialist exiles had kind of come back into Russia to either partake in the provisional government or, in the case of the Bolsheviks, claim that all the power rested in the Soviets and not in the actual provisional government, and hold the line that we should not actually be collaborating with the liberals in the provisional government. We should be fighting against them. He then began to write this text to outline what the state is from a Marxist perspective and why this is the correct line to hold of not cooperation with the bourgeoisie and, in fact, to fight against them. So some of the main characteristics we're going to talk about of the state, the first one being is that it is the product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. I tend to agree with Lenin that sometimes quoting from primary sources can be beneficial to an understanding of it before discussing it. So one of where's the line from Engels here?
This is number one of
this is the characteristics of the state, like an overview of the state. A lot of the inspiration that he's drawing from comes from a book called, I always mess up the order of it, but it's like The Origin of the State, the Family, and Private Property. So this is a quote from that. Engels says that the state is a product of society at a certain stage of development. It is the admission that this society has become entangled in an insoluble contradiction with itself, that it is cleft into irreconcilable antagonisms which it is powerless to dispel. But in order that these antagonisms, which are classes with conflicting economic interests, may not consume themselves and society in sterile struggle, a power apparently standing above society becomes necessary, whose purpose is to moderate the conflict and keep it within the bounds of order. And this power, arising out of society, but placing itself above it and increasingly separating itself from it, is the state. So what he's saying here is that the fact that the state exists proves that there are class antagonisms between the different classes existing within the state that cannot be resolved. The liberals, the bourgeoisie, they tend to view the state as an organ for class reconciliation, but the proletariat, who have been exploited under the boot of the bourgeoisie in a liberal state, understand otherwise. So this is essentially the basic line of why Lenin is saying that, like, there is we should not be attempting to collaborate with the bourgeoisie. This is going to be a bourgeois state. Any attempt at collaboration with them is going to eventually lead to our future oppression. It's not going to achieve our goals whatsoever. The next characteristic of the state that Lenin talks about are special bodies of armed men, prisons, etc. By this, he means standing armies, domestic police force, prison systems, things like that. He says that all states have them and that they serve the interests of the ruling class. There are multiple references to self-acting armed organizations of the population, which is kind of like what had originally been identified as like militias, standing armies, and such. But with the cleavage into class society and class division, that now essentially becomes impossible because that there are these irreconcilable antagonisms within class society. there cannot really be a standing body that is, or a body of armed men that represents all of society. If we are to have that, they are going to represent different class interests and come into conflict with each other. So the ones that we have currently serve the state, serve the bourgeoisie. You can see kind of the reaction to that when different working class parties, segments of the population have tried to form that, have tried to form essentially self-acting armed bodies to serve their class. The Black Panthers is a good example. That was essentially a self-acting armed organization for self-defense of the black working class, and you see the reaction that that the FBI gave it. Yes.
Can we talk about this in the context of the May 7th encampment and maps? I think it relates to case of the last players and this use of violence on behalf of the state to suppress working class interests.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think that is, like, as Sachin is alluding to, that's a very good example because, I mean, there was something that was published recently that like 99% of the encampments were completely peaceful. So you're looking at this, like within the confines of this Constitution, we're essentially, within the bourgeois Constitution, we're asserting our First Amendment rights in their viewpoint and acting entirely peacefully, but then we are still having the arm, or the the boot of the state brought down on us, the oppressive arm of the state to come and break it up because we are simply straying from the narrative that the state is putting forward. Does that speak to, or do you have anything else you'd like to say on that?
No, just like the monopoly on violence.
Yeah.
The fact that we have to qualify that when the police don't talk, they're hurting us.
Yes, and I think that when we talked about colonial violence a little while ago, like the oh, sorry, Ty. Yeah, I think it's us. Okay. What Ty was saying is definitely like the most evident point of that. The police protect and serve, but what do they protect and serve? And it is capital. It is not us. The Supreme Court of this country has ruled that the police do not need to protect you. They have no responsibility to do so. It is evident at this point that if they're protecting and serving anything, it is the capital and the right to exploit the working class by the owning class. Yeah, no one's able to hear? Okay.
I may bring some more.
Yeah. That's very evident in the way that the Supreme... Back now. That's very evident in somewhat recent Supreme Court rulings where they have explicitly outlined that, like, the police do not need to protect us. They can watch us die on the ground and do not need to administer medical aid to us. They do not need to put themselves in the line to protect anybody if they're in danger. So there is no... It's very obvious that they only really serve the will of the state, which, as we live in a liberal bourgeois state, they serve the interests of capital. So as we've seen here, you can kind of draw a through line to understand that the state is Lenin views the state as an instrument for the exploitation of the oppressed class. That's number 3, yes. The state as an instrument for the exploitation of the oppressed class. He states that as a state arises out of class antagonisms and during class conflicts, it becomes the state of the economically dominant class. So when the state is arising, it might originally appear as a sort of like mediating, balancing act. But obviously, one class is always going to be the dominant class within a class society. So as the state comes into being more and continues to separate itself from society, it takes on the characteristics of the dominant class. You can see that as a through line throughout history, especially with the exploitation of whoever the oppressed class is. Like slavery, the states that existed served to oppress essentially create like a bureaucratic infrastructure for the exploitation of the slaves. Feudal society, you have the exploitation of the serfs and the peasants ruling for the monarchy. Capitalism, the workers are the exploited class. And then under socialism, the ruling class is the workers, and the exploited ones would be the previous ruling class, the bourgeoisie. With this, Lenin draws the conclusion that the state will eventually wither away, that an abolition an immediate abolition of the state is not possible within these contexts, that in order for the state, because the state arose out of class society, that class society needs to diminish and disappear before the state itself can also disappear. And that the way that that is believed to be done is through a reorganization of society and production. No, you don't need to write this one. Oh. A reorganization of society and productive forces to serve the majority of people instead of a group of a few elite will yield the eventual end of class antagonisms in that class society as a whole, thus ending the need for the state. It's in this passage too that Lenin makes a reference to a very unfortunately named term that Marx came up with called the dictatorship of the proletariat. In this context, when they're talking about dictatorship, they're referring to the bourgeoisie in the liberal capitalist society as a dictatorship of capitalism. They're not talking about it as like a dictator, as a single ruler ruling like a country, a nation or a country. They're viewing it as a group, a class being in control. So when he's talking about dictatorship of capital, he's referring to a liberal bourgeois democracy. When he's talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat, he's referring to a worker state in which the majority of society has democratic will in there. He is pointing out that within a liberal bourgeois state, there's democracy for the rich, but not democracy for the working class. We have the illusion of it, but no actual impact on many of actual policies. But in a worker state, it would be the opposite. The workers would have democracy. The majority of society would have democracy at the expense of the bourgeoisie and our former oppressors no longer having democracy. So essentially what he's talking about, dictatorship of the proletariat, will of the majority. Very poorly named word or phrase though. Before we start talking about reform or revolution, does anyone have any questions on State and Rev, the first chapter? I mean, this is my own personal view. I can't really speak for much, but like I do think that the withering of the way of the state is possible. I think that it is obviously an advanced stage, what Marx refers to as the higher stage of communism. Yeah. And I think when it comes to a lot of that, like we as we exist today within this liberal society cannot really picture what that looks like. It's yeah, in the same way that like a peasant working under the Tsar in Russia 300 years ago or whatever couldn't really picture like a liberal democracy like this or whatever. Like it's not. The conditions aren't really there to like really have an an image of that exactly, but so I think it's kind of falls on us to create the material conditions for those who then can, like, I think that's fair. Yeah, because like we have an idea of what a communist society, free of class, free of exploitation and everything like that. There's essentially like ideals of what that will be, but no actual vision for it. And I don't remember exactly where, but Engels has a quote that like it's up to us to like create the world for the people who can build that vision. But like we're not going to be the ones to build the vision, but we have to make the world possible for the people who can come that can build that, essentially. So I think it is possible. I do think what you're saying though is a very late stage thing where essentially global socialism has been achieved, and then you do not have forces of capital and reaction attempting to foment counter-revolution and coups. So yeah. So now that we have an understanding of the state, we should talk about if we're going to whether the proper path is reform or revolution. This is the title of a text by Rosa Luxemburg. She was originally born in Poland, but then found her way to Germany in the midst of a very divisive argument within the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany at that point. A man named Edward Bernstein had emerged who was arguing that through parliamentarianism and trade union, essentially trade union reform, that socialism could be achieved without the need for a violent revolution. He argued that instead of that the means were the ends. It was the end goal did not matter. It was the means of struggling within the trade union struggle and within the parliamentary system as an open socialist party, and that you would be able to achieve socialism that way. Rosa thought this was completely ridiculous, began writing polemics again. As a new person on the scene, began writing polemics against Bernstein that very quickly got picked up to be one of the party's position against it, and Bernstein was then dismissed, or not dismissed. His theories were dismissed and did not become part of the party. Unfortunately, the SPD later then goes on to vote in favor of joining World War I, which causes Rosa and a lot of the more radical wing of the SPD to split and form the anti-war Spartacus Bund. She is arrested for anti-war activities. The Spartacus Bund begins the Spartacus Uprising in an attempt to overthrow, or after World War I, the Spartacus Uprising begins in an attempt to overthrow the Weimar Republic in order to create a Marxist state in Germany. Her former party sends in a essentially a formation that would eventually go on to form much of the shock troops of Hitler's brown shirts, a group known as the Freikorps. They are essentially shell-shocked, battle-hardened, very conservative World War I veterans. They are sent in by her former party, former people who are still claiming to be socialists, to kill all the communists who are uprising. She is arrested, tortured, shot in the head, and then dumped in a river, unfortunately. So, I really like Rosa. I think she's a great writer. I think she exists in this interesting position during this time frame, as both her and Lenin were identifying what the state was and arguing against reformers within their own context. However, she was very critical of the October and Bolshevik Revolution. She did not agree in Lenin's theory of a vanguard party. She did not agree with, she spoke out against the Red Terror and the censorship of presses that occurred during Soviet Russia at the beginning. I feel like it would be interesting to see what she said afterwards, as during the Spartacus Uprising, there were things, they ended up censoring presses and doing many sort of things that she had originally spoken out against. So I'm curious, when she actually had to fight in a revolution and was forced to make these decisions, what her views would be coming out of it, but we will never know. So yeah, brief historical context of this text here. Throughout the beginning of the text, she is arguing that Bernstein is a revisionist because he does not think that the collapse of capitalism is inevitable, and he believes in a reformist route. Essentially, what he is arguing is that capitalism has adapted to the point that it can weather crises and that it will not lead to its own collapse, as Marx and everyone else had been outlining. They'd all been saying that capitalism is prone to crises every few years and it eventually will lead to its own collapse. Bernstein rejects that, and he says that with the introduction of things such as credit and cartels to manage prices, that those are going to be able to stave off the bigger crises of capitalism. Obviously very wrong, as credit is as we can see today, lines of credit and the ways that banks use them and things like that has only exacerbated our problems and crises. 2008 is a great example of that.
I think in some ways credit is problematic in that way, but I also think at least here in America in the 80s, credit allowed the free market to keep going. So it definitely produces crises, but it almost creates this illusion as well for the middle classes.
Yes. Yeah. I think it prolongs a crisis.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So it gives the illusion of being able to stave it off, but I think that if you're now being propped up entirely by credit, once that crisis comes, it's going to hit even harder. So while it might give the illusion of kind of prolonging and preventing a crisis, it does then exacerbate and make that collapse when it happens so much more damaging. He also argued that the trade union struggle, if you've ever read Lenin's text, What is to be Done, he calls this economism in this. He argued that the trade union struggle would lead to reforms that would increase worker power and their share of wealth, reducing the role of the state to just an administrative role. Yeah, this has been a line that has been being held by some socialists for some time now. basically Rosa refutes this and says that this theory that Bernstein is like putting forward is it's a bourgeois theory. It is in line with a lot of what capitalists actually believe, that there is infinite growth in the market. Eventually, the market is going, like, there's only so much international market share that can be taken up by a certain nation at a time, and that while that is happening, the state might be willing to make concessions to the working class when it's in their favor to kind of keep them placated, give them a bigger cut of the pie as they're getting a bigger share of like the international market. But once that all dries up, they are going to start taking profits from the workers. They are going to, things that were given to us during parliamentary reforms are going to be taken away. They're not secured anymore. They're only piecemeal things given in a certain moment when it is beneficial to the ruling class. Yeah, so I think this also can kind of like relate into like fascism to some extent. You see that in Germany, like after the defeat of World War I, basically they have their entire colonial like territories are essentially taken from them. They're reduced to a smaller state on the world stage, and the exploitation sharpens and is really turned inward. I'm not going to be like that is the direct road to fascism, but it is definitely, sets the grounds for fascism and you see that in the US today and everything like that. As the empire is collapsing, as we are on our descent from being the only global hegemon, you see the oppression really sharpening here, the fascistic rhetoric being dialed up by both parties. Yeah, so fascism obviously wasn't an ideology at that point, but you can kind of see Rosa identifying the seeds of like the sharpening of the knives as the frontier closes and as they're turned inwards, essentially. She points to, even at this point, there's evidence in England that the trade union struggle is on the defensive. They've gotten to the point where now they've reached their gains. They have power within Parliament and everything like that. But now that the rate of profit is falling internationally and they are attempting to extract more profit from their workers at home, basically all of the trade unions in England are now completely on the defensive, only scrambling to preserve the gains that they had previously made. So even while he's presenting this theory, it's falling apart in other countries. She also argues that shareholders and credit, corporations, etc., will eventually make personal management by the capitalists unnecessary, creating a further class divide and a more difficult struggle. Yeah, I think that one speaks for itself. And then, as this text goes on, in chapter 4, Capitalism and the State, she also comes to the same conclusion that Lenin does, that the state has a class characteristic. She identifies the path of history that all Marxists do. And then she says that the state became a capitalist state with the victory of the bourgeoisie. And that, yeah. Okay, I kind of jumped all over in my notes on this. Essentially, the main argument that he's presenting here is that through reform, the state can become less capitalist, more socialist. The working class can win more power through legislative reform and trade union struggle. She argues the opposite, that over time, the state is going to take on more and more of a bourgeois class character, and that the struggle within the trade unions is going to become sharper and sharper and harder and go completely on the defensive. She continues to assert that the role of trade unions in electoral struggle are the means of guiding and educating the working class. They are a means for struggle, but not the vehicle for it. They are useful because they unite workers together. They make workers identify as a class together and identify their own class interests and develop class consciousness. And then she also argues that the parliamentary struggle is not a way that we are going to win reforms, or not a way that we are going to win socialism. Any reforms will be piecemeal and can be taken away in inopportune times, and that the parliamentary struggle should be used only as a way for the working class, the proletariat, the socialists to be convinced that radical social change is impossible via cooperation and via reform. The trade unions must be used to elevate working class consciousness, and there are tools to unite the working class, but once they are viewed as a tool via which socialism will be achieved, they lose their effectiveness and cease to be a vehicle for real radical change and winning working class power. She then begins to argue that if the party adopts Bernstein's theories, that it will adopt a policy of compensation, resulting in nothing but empty promises, and eventually the disillusionment of the socialist project in the working class with socialism and Marxism in general. She has a really great quote I'd like to read here, alluding to all of that. It is not true that socialism will arise automatically from the daily struggle of the working class. Socialism will be the consequence of 1, the growing contradictions of capitalist economy, and 2, of the comprehension by the working class of the unavailability of the suppression of these contradictions through a social transformation. When, in the manner of revisionism, the first condition is denied and the second rejected, the labor movement finds itself reduced to a single cooperative and reformist movement. We move here in a straight line toward the total abandonment of the class viewpoint. She's arguing here that if they're going to go down this route, they are completely abandoning the viewpoint from the working class and falling in line with the bourgeois view of the state of class, and that socialism will never be achieved in that capacity. And yeah, as essentially the rest of the text is her explaining how Bernstein and his theories have abandoned the working class, how he has essentially completely abandoned the foundation of Marxism and is trying to force this revisionist theory upon his party. She asserts the theory, or concludes that co-ops and trade unions cannot transform society into socialism on their own, but that they are strong vehicles for struggle in which battle and transformation can take place. But viewing them as just forming co-ops, forming trade unions, and using that as the vehicle for struggle to achieve socialism is how she views not an effective strategy. But she makes it very clear that she is not against struggle within those in any capacity, that they are very important vehicles or they are very important tools within the struggle for socialism. She concludes that reform and revolution are not different methods of historical development. They are different factors in the development of class society that exist alongside of each other, that should be used alongside of each other and not one or the other. So I think that understanding this a bit more in our context, and both in the context of Palestine and the Zionist state, is important too. In this text, Rosa is arguing that a reformist route is completely flawed and not the path to socialism whatsoever. This is being done at a time when there is an open socialist party openly advocating for socialist policies, winning parliamentary seats in a parliamentary republic too, not even in a presidential republic like we have, something that is more viable for actual smaller parties to run in. So you have an actual socialist party winning seats on real socialist policies, winning actual reforms, trade unions with strong ideological leanings of socialism and such, and actually class conscious working class. And even during this period, she is arguing that a reformist route to socialism is impossible. Within our own context, we don't have any of that, and you still have people who are attempting to do essentially entryism into the Democratic Party to pull it left. You have people who think that we can actually achieve real socialistic reforms through the Democratic Party. The Bernie Sanders campaign and everything is a perfect example of that. None of that is going to really achieve what we are actually going for. None of it is actually even really a path forward. Bernie Sanders would have been, if he had won, would have been completely impotent without a Democratic supermajority. So, why? It's just something that I think I know a lot of us are probably already on this page, but it is something that people in the United States do not really recognize and still try to identify with these reformist paths, even though we are not anywhere close to the position these people were in when they were arguing against it in the first place. When we start applying this to the context of, say, Palestine, it gets even worse. They don't really even have a state as it exists. They have the closest thing that they really have that is heading in the direction of forming a state is the Palestinian Authority. And what does the Palestinian Authority do? They have their own. They arrest. Is like the IDF will not go into the West Bank to arrest people. Typically, they will have Palestinians employed by the Palestinian Authority will arrest Palestinians and then bring them into the Zionist state for like jail time. They're essentially attempting to reform a reformist path for Palestinian statehood, and it has led them to walking not only complete lockstep with the bourgeoisie, but complete lockstep with their colonizers. And really, I think the message that we should take away in our context is that a reformist, if socialism, if radical change in our society is something that we actually want to see, that attempting to use reforms to get there is not like an even possible path. And also for the Palestinian context, it means that their only possible path is violent resistance. And from that conclusion, we should the only position that we should really have is supporting the Palestinian resistance from this. That's the only conclusion that I can really draw from that. When their only path to statehood is essentially just a collaborator with their genociders. Any questions, thoughts, anything? Sorry, it's a little rambly today. I don't usually do this. Okay, cool. Thank you.